Welcome back to the Itch Review, where we break down the latest allergy and immunology studies to help busy clinicians, patients, and caregivers stay up to date with current research. Each episode comes with a one-page infographic, so head to the show notes to follow along. Today we're talking about antihistamines, and if fexofenadine, also known as Allegra, really doesn't make you sleepy or groggy. This episode is made in partnership with the Allergy and Asthma Network. We want to thank Opella for sponsoring today's episode. While they support the show, all opinions are our own and sponsorship doesn't influence our content or editorial decisions. Any mentions of brands is for informational purposes only and not an endorsement. Now let's get into it. You're listening to The Itch, a podcast exploring all things allergy, asthma, and immunology. Welcome back to the Itch Review, everyone. We have with us Dr. G, Dr. Gupta, and our third co-host, Dr. Michael Blaiss. We're very excited to have you back for our second episode. Today, we are talking about a systematic review from the Current Medical Research and Opinion. It was published July 2024, and it's called Why Fexofenadine is Considered a Truly Non-Sedating Antihistamine with No Brain Penetration. Why don't we jump right in? Dr. Blaiss, why don't you tell us a little bit more about fexofenadine? It's an antihistamine. What do we need to know about that before we jump into this article?
I think the first thing we need to understand that there are a lot of different types of what we call H1 antihistamines out there. Almost all of them are now over the counter, so anyone can get them. And we use these to treat allergic conditions like allergies, especially nasal allergies and eye itching, and also for the treatment of hives. Now, it's important to note we divide these into two main types. So we talk about first generation antihistamines and second generation antihistamines. And let's start with the first generation antihistamines. So the one probably everyone's the most familiar with is diphenhydramamine or Benadryl. There are many others like chlorpheniramine, one by prescription that still use some, hydroxyzine, and these have been around for decades. In fact, if you go back the history of Benadryl, it was discovered in 1943 by a researcher at the University of Cincinnati. So it's been around a long time. Now, all these drugs work by blocking the histamine receptor, and we have these histamine receptors throughout our body, in the nose, in the lungs, in the skin, also, as we'll talk about, even in our brain. Now, what we need to understand is that these first generation antihistamines cross what we call the blood-brain barrier. And the way to think about this, it's kind of like a security gate for your brain. And what this is primarily formed by these endothelial cells, or these cells that line the capillaries that go into the brain. And these cells are tightly bound together, what we call tight junctions, so things can't get through there easily. Now, drugs like the first generation antihistamines, like Benadryl, are what we call very lipophilic, so they're very fat-loving. And they can sneak through these tight junctions. And in fact, they can get into the brain and bind to histamine receptors in the brain. Now, it's interesting to note our brain has what we call endogenous histamine. There's histamine being produced, and that kind of keeps us alert and going. So if you give an antihistamine that gets into the brain, well, what happens then? Well, it blocks that. So we get sedation, we get fatigue, we get a slower reaction, we get a decrease in our motor skills. And I think we have to remember here is that can be very risky. That can have a problem with kids as far as their activity, but especially if you're doing mechanical types of things, especially if you're driving, because in fact you can be impaired, and that can obviously lead to fatal outcomes. So to solve this problem, scientists developed second generation antihistamines. And these are the ones like cetirizine, which is Zyrtec, loratadine, which is Claritin, fexofenadine, which we're talking about today, which is Allegra, levocetirizine, which is Xyzal. Now, these are more targeted, and they do not readily cross the blood-brain barrier. They're also lipophobic. They're fat hating. So again, makes it harder to cross. And also in these cells in the capillaries, there's this protein called P-glycoprotein. And it basically acts as bouncing out these drugs out of the brain. So these second generation antihistamines have a lot less sedation or no sedation compared to the first generation drugs. Now there's an interesting point that I want to make about the second generation, specifically about fexofenadine, is that we call this an inverse agonist. And what we mean here, it doesn't just block histamine, but it really stabilizes the inactive form of that histamine receptor. So what it's doing here is reducing the symptoms even when histamine is not being released. So these second generation drugs have been around, again, a long time also. In fact, fexofenadine's been around for over 26 years. So we really understand its role in allergic rhinitis and in chronic hives, how it improves symptoms and increases quality of life.
Wow, okay. That was a really interesting and very kind of cool summary of the history of antihistamines. So, if you don't mind, I'd love to quickly summarize what you said to see if I was able to take it all in. We have two types of antihistamines. We have first generation antihistamines and we have second generation antihistamines. And the big thing that I was hearing is that we have something called the blood brain barrier. And that's kind of like a security fence that can be crossed in our brain. And the interesting thing about our brain is that we have histamine in it, and the histamine in our brain is there to keep us alert. If I understood it, it works in a different way than I generally think of histamine, because histamine is always the thing that gets released when you meet an allergen. But in this case, it sounds like it's in the brain and it's keeping us a little bit more alert. First generation antihistamines can actually penetrate that barrier, that blood-brain barrier. And what happens is it goes in there and it's an antihistamine, so it impacts the histamine in your brain and it turns it off, and it makes you drowsy and it makes you sleepy and it doesn't make you as reactive. So they noticed that was happening, and so researchers went ahead and they created second generation antihistamines. And those second generation antihistamines don't cross the blood-brain barrier as easily. And I say as easily because I feel like we're going to talk about how some still do a little bit. So they don't cross the blood-brain barrier as easily, and because of that, they're not impacting us in the sense that we don't get drowsy or sleepy. Did I kind of get that right in terms of what first and second generation antihistamines are doing in our brains?
Absolutely. And I'll make one other comment. One of the misconceptions out there, and I hear this all the time, is that people think first generation antihistamines are more potent than second generation antihistamines, which is not true. And I think people think they may be more potent because they cause sedation. First generation antihistamines don't last as long in the bloodstream. That's why you'll see on the packages they have to be done 4 times a day or more in some cases, where the second generation agents we have are usually mostly once a day. Some are twice a day, but the vast majority are once a day. So they last a much longer period of time in the bloodstream.
That's a great point, Dr. Blaiss. I feel like I've been explaining that a lot more lately about the difference between first and second generation antihistamines in general. So today we're going to be talking about a study that is a systematic review. And what that means is that instead of running a brand new study, what researchers do is they gather all the best existing studies on a specific topic, and then they carefully analyze and compare them to figure out what all the studies are saying. And they do it in a very strict way to make sure that they're going through them in an unbiased way and that they're all based on solid science. So they look at how each study was done, how big it was, and how reliable the results were. And then they combine the data to get a much clearer picture of, quote unquote, the truth. So think of it like this. If one study is like hearing from one person, a systematic review is like getting a whole panel of experts together and having them all agree on the final word. But sometimes we still can't get the final word. So it's a bigger picture of what we've looked at so far on a certain topic. And that's why systematic reviews are a big deal in medicine. They help doctors and researchers and patients make better decisions based on the full scope of evidence that we have on a particular topic. And it's not just one study that happened to make the headlines. So this study in particular used something called the Embase database, and it's a go-to search engine for medical studies. And they looked for every possible connection between fexofenadine, which is a second generation antihistamine, and things like drowsiness, fatigue, cognitive impairment, and driving performance. And they search terms like REM sleep, alertness, psychomotor skills, and even in vitro and in vivo studies. So this includes both lab research and real world results. And then they put together the randomized controlled trials, reviews, and post-marketing data, meaning that the real results results from people actually taking the drug were also used. So the goal was to see how fexofenadine stacks up against other antihistamines and placebos when it comes to the effectiveness and safety, especially around sedation and cognitive function. So essentially, this systematic review looked at over 60 studies to see what they could find on this particular topic.
Thank you for explaining a systematic view, Dr. G. I feel like that's something we hear a lot as patients, but we don't necessarily know what that means. We can jump to conclusions, but to understand that what they're doing is they're taking a whole bunch of different studies that have already happened, and they're trying to see if they can answer a specific question. With this study, what did they find out about fexofenadine? Does it make us sleepy or drowsy? Does it cross that blood-brain barrier?
So, as we've already talked about the blood-brain barrier, and obviously how important that is, especially if you, again, looking at sedation with a medication, because does it cross there and lead to problems? So there is an objective way to look at how different antihistamines bind into the brain and could cause sedation. And so scientists use what's called a PET scan or PET scan. And this is short for a positron emission tomography. It's a way of scanning the brain. So what they do here, the person's given a very tiny amount of a very safe radioactive tracer, which lights up parts of the brain. And this particular tracer that is used, it highlights the brain's histamine receptors. So the spot where allergy medications, again, would attach in the brain could then cause sedation. So by using the special scanner, then they can watch really in real time how much of these receptors are being blocked by a particular antihistamine. And if in fact that antihistamine is blocking a lot of them, then it's more likely that antihistamine is going to lead to a sleepiness or cause a slowness in your thinking or reaction time. And if there are very few of these receptors that are getting bound in the brain, then the likelihood is that antihistamine is not going to, again, affect the brain in any way and not cause any drowsiness in the patient. So we have these PET scans, and they've been done basically with almost all antihistamines now to really give us a clear picture of what that drug is doing and how little the drug crosses that blood-brain barrier. And we call this the H1-Receptor Occupancy. And the more occupancy or binding to the brain, the more sedation. So we classify this as a drug would be sedating if over 50% of the receptors are bound in the brain. Less sedating would be 20 to 50%. Ideally, what we want are non-sedating, which is under 20% of brain occupancy. And if we look at this graph that's from the paper, and again, they took this from many different PET scans looking at H1 receptor occupancy in the brain. And you'll notice there's a group that's called the first generation antihistamines. And some of the abbreviations here are for things like CPM is chlorpheniramine, and DPHA is for diphenhydramine or Benadryl. But you'll notice all of those first generation drugs easily cross the blood-brain barrier, and you can see values here even into the high 70%. So again, these are definitely sedating types of antihistamines. You see with diphenhydramine, it averages here about 50% occupancy, so definitely sedating. Then if we look at the second generation antihistamines, you'll notice that the occupancy rate drops dramatically. Again, some are much more than others. So we have ones here that include things like loratadine and CET is cetirizine. And if we look down at the bottom, FEX is fexofenadine. So we can see here that in multiple studies, including even if we look at some of the doses of antihistamines that were used here, some were even double the usual dose. And we see with fexofenadine especially that there's virtually zero brain occupancy activity. In fact, one of the studies you see here it was minus 0.1%. There was a higher level of binding in the placebo group in the brain than in the fexofenadine group. In contrast, though, cetirizine, which is a commonly used second generation antihistamine Zyrtec, came in at 26%, putting it in the less sedating range. If you look at the product label for cetirizine, it does have a warning about sedation. This is important, these studies, because they back up the different psychomotor studies that have been done with these different antihistamines, and especially showing that with the use of fexofenadine, and it's in a lot of the studies in this paper, that patients did it as well as placebo. So there was no impairment versus, again, cetirizine, which showed signs of sleepiness and slower thinking.
And I just want to mention that that 26% was for the double dose of cetirizine, so it wasn't for the commonly used dose. Cetirizine does look like it's the highest, but it's because we're looking at the double dosing there.
I think it's important to point that out, so thank you. And again, a lot of times we as allergists, when we're treating hives, especially what we call chronic hives, sometimes I'll go up to 4 times the recommended dose. So we do need to realize that in some of these products, when we are using more than the recommended dose, we can get sedation.
When you're looking at this chart, it's very important to notice the numbers next to the abbreviations, because that's what's giving us an indicator of the dose. That's why we're pointing out that cetirizine here, the 20 milligram dose, which is the double dose of normal dosing for cetirizine, that's the one that went all the way up to 26%. But the regular dose of cetirizine that most people are using was still around the same levels as other medications, but fexofenadine is showing lower rates of crossing the blood-brain barrier. This is giving us the ranges for the 60 milligram dose and the 120 milligram dose of fexofenadine. And we don't have the data in this chart for the other dosing, which is 180 milligrams, or if we're using double dose of fexofenadine. So when we're comparing studies and when we're comparing anything, we just need to really understand the details of what we're looking at and what we're comparing.
Yep.
I think that this graph is really cool because basically what they're showing us is they're showing us how much of the antihistamine is going into our brain. So it's very much just the numbers. It's not anything qualitative in the sense that like a patient is saying I'm drowsy, but it's just like what's happening when you take it and what do we see in the brain. And I just have to say it's really interesting because I was always told to take loratadine before bed and cetirizine during the day. And if I look at this graph, I'm like, I need to show this to my allergist. So it's just very interesting as a patient to be able to see these numbers reflected so clearly. And I also want to say thank you very much, Dr. G, for clarifying that we have to look at the numbers specifically. Don't just look at the pretty colorful lines, but really understand what those lines are representing. Because right off the bat, I'd be like, oh man, cetirizine is going to make you super tired. But again, that's if you're taking double dose, right? So thank you again for clarifying that.
Yeah, it's a super interesting aspect of what we're able to do with imaging and how much we're able to see. So next, we are looking at another important research tool that was looked at in other reviews, and that's something called the Proportional Impairment Ratio, or PIR. It measures how likely a drug is to interfere with your cognitive or motor performance. So things like reaction time, alertness, and coordination. So researchers use both what we call subjective tests, which means what a patient reports to us, like how sleepy are you feeling? And then a patient might give us a numerical value on that. And then we want to also look at objective measures. And an objective test is something that you can actually see or quantify or record. And it gives us results that are not influenced by the person's personal feelings on any given topic that we might be asking them about. When we're looking at these objective tests, we're looking at things like driving simulations or reaction speed tasks. In one extensive review by McDonald and colleagues, they analyzed dozens of studies and calculated the PIR, which again is the proportional impairment ratio, for multiple antihistamines. So for fexofenadine, the results showed that across 92 objective tests, only one showed any impairment. And it was considered what we say not statistically significant. And what that means is that there wasn't anything statistically significant, meaning that fexofenadine did not impair those people more than any other medication might have. And so in 26 subjective tests, even with a dose of 360 milligrams, which is twice the dose of fexofenadine, fexofenadine scored a PIR of 0, meaning there were no reported drowsiness or sedation events. In another systematic review in Japan by Isomura and colleagues, they compared PIR scores for all antihistamines available in their market, and fexofenadine came out with the lowest impairment scores across objective and subjective measures, including at doses of 60, 80, 120, 180, 240, and then up to that 360 milligram dose.
So I think it's important to understand that fexofenadine in the US, in the United States, has two different dosing regimens. It can either be given as 60 milligrams twice a day, so a total of 120 milligrams, or 180 milligrams once a day. So it's important when we look at these studies to realize that there are, in fact, two different dosing regimens in the United States.
Thank you. That was something I was curious about because Dr. G mentioned that the one review looked at so many different doses. So thank you for clarifying that. Regarding what Dr. G was talking about, the proportional impairment ratio. So just to understand, this is both a combination of patients reporting and a combination of tests that scientists or researchers use to know exactly what kind of outcomes they're going to get. So it's much more clear for them as to what the result is going to be versus me saying, I'm sleepy. Maybe my sleepiness is a little bit different than someone else's sleepiness who's just got a baseline tired all the time. So it's just important to understand that when they're looking at these different things, some are much more subjective because everyone has a different understanding of what sleepy could mean to them. Whereas the other ones, which are objective, means that there is a clear outcome that they're looking for. So curious to hear about some of the studies that they were looking at in terms of how they measured whether fexofenadine was making us sedated or not. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
They cover a lot of different studies that have been done throughout the year looking at fexofenadine and other antihistamines on patients' ability to function. And there are two I want to highlight here that I thought were extremely interesting and important for all of us. So one is a study by John Weiler out of the University of Iowa. And they looked at the effects of fexofenadine and diphenhydramine, again, Benadryl, and alcohol on driving performance. And this was a randomized, placebo-controlled trial. And they used, at the University of Iowa, their driving simulator. So they wanted to look at the impact of fexofenadine, diphenhydramine, again, two antihistamines, and as well as alcohol, and how did that affect ability to drive in this simulated situation. Just to give you the key findings they found was that diphenhydramine significantly impaired driving performance more than alcohol. And the people that were in this study, the subjects with alcohol, they had a dose that they were legally intoxicated. Yet in this study, diphenhydramine showed more impaired driving performance, especially if you look at lane weaving. They also showed that obviously alcohol impaired driving in the patient, but it was lesser extent than what was seen with diphenhydramine or Benadryl. Fexofenadine here had no significant impairment as far as driving performance compared to placebo. So I think what this study pointed out is that they also showed that participants that were in this study underestimated their own impairment, especially, in fact, when they were taking diphenhydramine or Benadryl. And I hear this from patients that they say, well, I can take these drugs, but they don't impair me. I'm still able to function. But yet, when you do these special tests, you find out these patients are impaired when they take medications like diphenhydramine. And one other study that I want to mention was published in an interesting journal. This is Aviation, Space, and Environmental Medicine. And what they wanted to look at were the cognitive skills, looking at two different second-generation antihistamines, fexofenadine at 180 milligrams once a day and cetirizine at 10 milligrams once a day on naval flight personnel. So this was another randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial with 72 healthy Navy pilots. And they used a special test that's been developed, and that's called the aeromedical vigilance test. Again, testing things that pilots should be able to do. And they looked at this under normal atmospheric conditions, but also it simulated altitudes of 10,000 and 15,000 feet. Now, why did they do that? Because obviously the pilots are high in the air, there's less oxygen, so that could impair them some. So, what happens if you add these other medications? So, what did they find in the studies? So, with fexofenadine, they found that the performance on this test was comparable to placebo in all conditions. So, it didn't matter if they were at 10 or 15,000 feet. And so, there was no effect on cognitive function. On the cetirizine group, they showed a significant increase in what were called the aeromedical vigilant test errors after taking cetirizine, especially if they were in those simulated altitudes of 10,000 and 15,000 feet. So, what does that tell us? That cetirizine may impair cognitive performances in environments requiring high vigilance, like flying a plane. Again, in this study, when they asked the pilots about drowsiness, there was no significant difference between placebo, fexofenadine, and cetirizine, even though, again, they were able to show in this study that cetirizine was impairing. I think this is very important to note, and it's important to note that cetirizine is not allowed by pilots because of its possible effect on cognitive performance.
I think that's super interesting to hear, especially since we just talked about objective versus subjective, where you explain that I've also had that experience that's like, I don't necessarily feel drowsy. That's my subjective experience. But objectively, I probably am much worse driver if I was on Benadryl. We have to remember that like this objective and subjective when looking at studies is a really interesting thing to think about. And those studies showed us that in essence. And also just how interesting it is to hear that they looked at that in the pilots and they stimulated even more stressful situations, and the fexofenadine didn't do anything for their cognitive abilities.
Yeah, exactly. It is really interesting when you look at subjective and objective data for things like this. And that's why it's so important that we do look at both of those kind of things when we're looking at different measures. And so, again, the systematic review did a lot of different aspects of fexofenadine and different studies. And so, other studies showed that even at off label high doses of 360 milligrams, and as Dr. Blaiss had mentioned, we use this for certain conditions like urticaria or hives, we use higher doses of antihistamines. So we can use 360 milligrams for our patients. That fexofenadine performed just like placebo, and placebo again is a dummy medication. It doesn't have any actual medication in it, but we give patients a pill so that when they're taking something, they don't get skewed in one direction or the other. And so when we looked at people on either the actual fexofenadine or the placebo pill, the patients performed just like they would on placebo on tests of attention, sedation, and motor control. So this was confirmed by reaction time tests like the Stanford Sleepiness Scale and tasks like mental arithmetic and digit substitution. So again, the Stanford Sleepiness Scale is another objective scale, a bunch of questions that were given to patients. The math tasks were also an objective measure that was used. And both of them found that fexofenadine at higher doses and the placebo showed similar results. Plus, a 14-day double-blind study on over 500 patients with ragweed allergies found no sedative effects at any dose of fexofenadine. So that was 60 milligrams, 120 milligrams, or 240 milligrams twice a day. And in another large study of over 43,000 patients, fexofenadine had the lowest sedation rate after adjusting for age and sex, and far lower than loratadine. And there's even evidence in children in a pooled analysis of trials. So that means in a bunch of different trials that were done, they put them all together or pooled them all together. And these were done in kids between the ages of 6 to 11 years of age and at doses up to 60 milligrams twice a day. And what they saw here was that the fexofenadine was shown to be safe and non-sedating. And for adults, it isn't just about symptom control. Another study showed that adults on fexofenadine missed fewer work days and had better productivity and experienced less daily impairment overall. And lastly, NASA even approved it for its pilots. So, there are a lot of studies that looked at fexofenadine and showed that it, in fact, is not sedating and doesn't seem to really penetrate that blood-brain barrier.
Thank you, Dr. G, for explaining more of the studies that were looked at. This has been really interesting as someone who's been on and off antihistamines for a long time. But I would love to just give a quick couple of takeaways that I've heard so far that we've talked about. So one was really the PET or PET information, where we learned whether the antihistamine enters the brain or not, and they were able to see that. And in this case, they saw that fexofenadine didn't, because they could see it in the brain visually. There was other things like the different studies they did with driving, which was eye-opening for me. So basically, don't drink and drive. Also, don't diphenhydramine and drive. But you can fexofenadine and drive. That's what we learned in that study. And that they looked at pilots and different antihistamines, and they found that with fexofenadine, pilots can still respond the same way they normally do without it. And then what Dr. G said about different quality of life studies, about your performance, and what fexofenadine does to people at work, or it doesn't do to people at work, should I say. So it's just been interesting to hear all of the different ways that scientists or researchers have looked at this specific antihistamine and how it works on the patient, from visual brain scans to asking them how they're feeling. So in the end, what we've learned is that fexofenadine doesn't make you sleepy, pretty much. As someone who was told that diphenhydramine was my go-to in an anaphylactic reaction as a kid, to obviously knowing that that's not the case anymore, we use epinephrine, I still have this kind of like love affair with Benadryl, even though I know it's not going to be the best solution for me. Listening to this systematic review has really taught me a lot more about why I should trust second generation antihistamines more than I thought. And I honestly feel like I fell into the camp of thinking that second generation antihistamines didn't have as much of a kick as first generation, and that's why I still want to have like a bottle of Benadryl around me. And this review really has changed my mind about how I feel about antihistamines.
Yeah, and I also just want to say that different people respond to different medications in different ways. This review just looked at fexofenadine and sedation, but then there's a lot of different factors to consider when we're trying to decide which medication might be best for our patient. Sedation is one of them. Again, different patients might respond to different second generation antihistamines in a different way for their particular condition.
Dr. Blaiss, do you have any take-home points after reviewing this study?
Well, I agree with Dr. G. I think we have a lot of excellent second generation antihistamines out there. This data is very reassuring on fexofenadine, demonstrating that it does not have any impairing effect and one can do all their normal activities on it without any problems. Also, I really want to emphasize, because I still see so many pharmacists, physicians still recommending first generation antihistamines like diphenhydramine for allergic conditions. And we have to remember, we've talked about the sedation here. There are other side effects associated with these agents, especially anticholinergic effects. So these are effects where you get a lot of dryness. It can affect your eyesight. In men, it can cause urinary problems. And there's been a push in Europe by some of the allergy organizations to have these first generation antihistamines, especially a diphenhydramine, removed from the market. One other thing I think, and I do a lot with pediatrics, is understanding that there can be toxicity and death seen in children with overdose of diphenhydramine. And in 2016, a study demonstrated that Benadryl overdoses made up about 3.2% of drug overdose deaths in the US. I don't think that's something people know. And in the same study, Benadryl ranked in the top 15 drugs most frequently involved in drug overdose in the US. And most of these occurred in children 6 years or younger. So we need to understand that, again, we have better drugs out there now, the second generation antihistamines, and we should not be using first-generation antihistamines to treat allergic disorders.
Thank you, Dr. G and Dr. Blaiss, for going over that review with us. I hope everyone has a better idea of what antihistamines might be better for them. And remember that we have a cheat sheet / infographic for you, so grab that in the show notes.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Remember that all information you hear today is for informational purposes only and are not intended to serve as a substitute for the consultation, diagnosis, and/or medical treatment of a qualified physician or healthcare provider. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast and sharing with your friends and family who might also be interested in learning more about allergies, asthma, and immunology. You can always stay up to date by checking out our Instagram, The Itch Podcast, where you can leave questions you are itching to know, or check out our website, which is www.itchpodcast.com, which contains more information about the subjects we covered in today's episode and every episode. Until next time, have a fabulous week.